It kind of made me realize that no matter how much I don't like something, freedom of speech is still what's most important.
The most interesting thing that I heard was about the process between thinking and speaking, and that speaking kind of precedes thinking.
I think the most interesting thing that I heard today was the different perspectives on the 4 different examples you gave regarding the Supreme Court and their rulings.
And I also thought it was really good how you brought up like data to go with all the statements you were saying.
G'day y'all. This is episode 8 of the Matt Sweeny Show. Charlie Kirk was shot and killed on a college campus yesterday. Charlie was the founder of Turning Point USA, and he was a believer in truth and free speech. Recently, I was invited by Turning Point USA at Tusculum University to give a talk on free speech. I'm publishing this now as a tribute to Charlie. Thank you, Turning Point USA at Tusculum University, for the invitation to speak today, and thank you all for your time. My name's Matt Sweeny. I'm an entrepreneur, and I started the drone delivery company that conducted the first ever government-approved drone delivery in America. I'm also the founder of the Freedom Center at Tusculum University, which is designed to teach top students about how to found a company and about the founding values of America. So, let's talk about freedom of speech. I think freedom of speech is important because it's not only about your freedom to speak, it's about your freedom to think. Also, freedom of speech is critical to the pursuit of truth, and I think that truth is good. So the question arises, where does freedom of speech come from? And I believe it comes from God. It's explained by natural rights theory, and our rights exist independently of government. In fact, the reason that we institute governments is to defend our rights. And finally, we'll interactively explore freedom of speech with 4 case studies. 1, the Ku Klux Klan. 2, Nazis. 3, burning the American flag. And 4, a current hot topic in the second Trump administration. So let's start with what is freedom of speech and why is it important? Well, I think that speaking is thinking. So when I'm talking about freedom of speech, what I really think we're talking about is your freedom to think. Your freedom to think the thoughts that you choose to think. So Aristotle wrote that we learn to speak before we learn to write. And we all know and generally agree that writing is a higher form of thinking. But have you ever stopped to think that speaking is also a form of thinking? When we speak, we put forward ideas, we test them, we see how others react to them, and then those ideas develop our ideas further. So I think this is a really critical point that's often not spoken about, which is that speaking is actually thinking. Now, as an example, I learned this for the first time working with NASA. So I'm an entrepreneur. I spent time in Silicon Valley in California. And Silicon Valley has a culture of communication that is very succinct. It's short and to the point. And so I remember I did a tour of NASA Langley, and it was a huge culture shock for me because the impression that I got was that these NASA folks, they talk all day long, right? They sit around a table and they talk. And I thought this was like a Southern thing. I thought it was like a cultural thing initially. But then we ended up hiring the head of NASA's program to fly drones over people and in controlled airspace to lead our engineering. And what I came to learn is that this is much deeper than that. This is a method of thinking that involves talking through the problems and the challenges up front so that you solve them before the engineering work begins. And so what I learnt from my experience working with NASA is that speaking is thinking. Another example, which I learnt from George Orwell's 1984. In the book, Syme is a colleague of Winston at the Ministry of Truth, and he's an expert in Newspeak, which is the party's official language. Syme says, "You don't grasp the beauty of the destruction of words. Do you know that Newspeak is the only language in the world whose vocabulary gets smaller every year?" Winston did know that, of course. He smiled sympathetically, he hoped, not trusting himself to speak. Syme bit off another fragment of the dark-coloured bread, chewed it briefly, and went on, "Don't you see the whole aim of Newspeak is to narrow the range of thought? In the end, we shall make thought crime literally impossible because there will be no words in which to express it." I think George Orwell's key point here was that if you censor the ability to speak or write, you're actually censoring the ability to think. Syme continued, "How could you have a slogan like "freedom is slavery" when the concept of freedom has been abolished? The whole climate of thought will be different. In fact, there will be no thought as we understand it now. Another example is a theory of mine, which is that limiting the amount of speech limits the ability to think critically. So for example, before Elon Musk bought Twitter, Twitter had a 140 character limit. My theory is that this limit over time caused speech to trend in the direction of limited speech, and this led to limited critical thinking. The extension of this theory is that any broadcast medium that limits the length of media or conversation limits the ability to think critically. And I think if we look at modern podcasting, especially the emergence of Joe Rogan, podcasting has had a transformative impact on public dialogue. And I think it's because long-form speaking is long-form critical thinking. So the second reason, so to conclude this point, when we say speaking is thinking, and that your freedom of speech really means your freedom to think, I think it becomes very clear that no one else has the right to control what you think. Those who would censor what you can say, what you can listen to, what you can read, what you can write, what media you can publish, or what media you can consume, are really trying to control what thoughts you're allowed to have in your own head. Second, I think that freedom of speech is critical to the pursuit of truth, and I think that truth is good. Freedom of speech is critical to the pursuit of truth because it creates a marketplace of ideas where truth can emerge, grow, and prevail. So free and open speech is critical to enable the truth to emerge and grow. So let's think of this in terms of emergence and growth. I think that truth is like a young sapling, a baby tree. It's fragile and it can be stomped out easily. So it must emerge within an environment where it's given the chance to grow into a mighty oak. That's the marketplace of ideas. I also think that truth is good. You know, this may be self-evident, but I'll give you some reasons why I think truth is good. Well, I believe the pursuit of truth leads you to God. I also believe truth is an essential ingredient in things that are good. Truth is essential to love. Truth is essential to relationships. Truth is essential to the scientific method and leads us to knowledge. Truth is essential to you making informed choices in your life. And truth is essential to meaning and self-worth. And if you doubt that truth is good, what would you rather pursue? What would you substitute for the truth? Would you rather pursue happiness? Aldous Huxley shows in Brave New World that a society that prioritizes happiness comes at the expense of individualism and meaning. Would you rather pursue pleasure? King Solomon pursued pleasure, and he wrote in Ecclesiastes, "I have seen everything that is done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and a striving after the wind." So freedom of speech is critical to the pursuit of truth, and truth is critical to that which is good. Question?
I was recently in a Bible class, religion class. We studied the Old Testament and New Testament. When you brought up King Solomon, I found that really interesting because he also said that wisdom is despair. So I was curious what your thoughts were on that, because he kind of presents both ends of pleasure is pointless, but truth is also despair.
So the question was that this lady also read King Solomon's writing recently, and King Solomon also said that wisdom is despair. So I think my first comment is I'd want to read it to be sure, but I think that what you're saying based on my memory is correct. And it may well be true that truth doesn't necessarily lead you to happiness and that wisdom is despair, because happiness might not be the highest order. Serving others might be a higher order than happiness, and wisdom may make you a better servant of others, which presumably King Solomon was as a king. Well, he was supposed to be. But I mean, that was a great question, and thank you for asking it. So, where does freedom of speech come from? Well, I believe that freedom of speech comes from God. Christians, biblically, have a responsibility to put God above government if there is a conflict between the two. And exercising this responsibility requires free speech. For example, in the book of Daniel, the king required whoever makes petition to any god or man for 30 days, except to King Darius, shall be cast into the den of lions. In other words, the king censored Daniel's ability to pray to God. Daniel prayed to God anyway, and God protected him from the lions. The truth will set you free and bring you to God. For example, in John, Jesus said to the Jews who had believed him, "If you abide in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." And Christians have a responsibility to speak the truth in love. For example, Ephesians says, "Speaking the truth in love, we are to grow up in every way into him who is the head, into Christ." So I believe that this shows that free speech comes from God. It is a God-given right. Question?
One other thing about the speaking truth to power, going against the government in pursuit of God notion. Again, this kind of goes back to my Bible class. I'd also recently read the New Testament, in which Jesus says that to obey the government is to obey God, and that government is instated by God's hand. And so, by disobeying the government, you are disobeying God. What do you think of that?
This was another excellent question about the Bible, Jesus saying that Christians have a responsibility to obey government because government is instituted by God. Once again, I'd like to read the text, but I think you're right. And I think that the point where a conflict emerges is if if government tries to get between you and God, at which point in time your primary responsibility is to God, not to government. And I think that the Founding Fathers probably shared a similar view, and the excesses of government overreach led to them deciding to split from the king and create the United States of America. So the origin of free speech has also been explained by natural rights theory. John Locke wrote in the Second Treatise on Government that the natural liberty of man is to be free from any superior power on earth. This means, in the beginning, individuals exist in a state of nature where they are free and equal, and they have the inherent right to speak freely before any government exists. And that the reason individuals come together to institute a government, to form a government, to create a government, is to defend those natural rights. Freedom of speech does not come from the First Amendment. The First Amendment tells the government not to infringe a right we already have. It does not create the right. The Constitution of the United States is about carving up power and limiting it. Article 1 carves legislative power and puts it in the legislative branch, Congress and the Senate. Article 2 puts executive power in the executive branch, the president. Although the founders may not have foreseen the growth of federal agencies or the so-called independent government agencies like the Federal Reserve, many of whom are arguably unaccountable to the president in a way the founders may not have envisioned. Article 3 puts the judicial power in the judicial branch, the courts. Article 4 puts power in the states. Article 5 makes it hard to change, makes the Constitution the highest law in the land, and Article 7 makes it hard to change. But even after all these separations of powers and checks and balances, the founders insisted we also list out individual rights in a Bill of Rights to further check the power of a federal government. And 3 years after the Constitution was ratified, the Bill of Rights, containing the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, was also ratified. And they put the First Amendment first for a reason. They wrote, the full text of the First Amendment is, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Look at the way it's written, the freedom of speech. It's written because the freedom of speech already exists. It doesn't say we're creating this right. It says this right already exists. We're creating a government and the Congress shall make no law abridging it. Question?
Do you think that it is conforming with this idea of the government respecting freedom of speech above all for Trump to deport university students for doing peaceful protests?
The question that was just asked is, do I think it's consistent with the First Amendment for Trump to deport university students for peaceful protests? So in a moment, I'm actually going to provide 4 examples, and you've just picked one of them. So I'm going to ask you what you think, and then I'll tell you what I think.
I think it's a gross, just spitting on the freedom of speech.
So let me come to that, and then I'll ask you, and I'll actually make it interactive so that I can see what everyone else thinks. But I will tell you what I think to that. I will. But great question again. So the other sort of key point to point out about the First Amendment is the order of the rights protected are protected in that order for a reason. God is first, free speech is second. And I believe this is consistent with what I said earlier. God gave us free speech. The Supreme Court has interpreted the First Amendment to cover the entire federal government, including the executive branch, not just the Congress. And just in case that doesn't work out, there's a Second Amendment to defend these rights against a tyrannical government just as the founders defended these rights against a tyrannical king. So now we come to what speech is not freedom of speech. I'm going to give you 4 scenarios. I'm going to ask that you imagine that you are a Supreme Court justice and that you will be ruling on each of these 4 cases. And let's make this interactive. On this side of the room, your right, my left, move to that side of the room if you think it is free speech and you're siding with the person. If you're not sure, go to the middle. If you think the government is within its rights to block or prosecute this type of speech, go to your left, my right. So scenario 1 is the Ku Klux Klan. Here are the facts. A leader in the KKK gives a speech at a Klan rally that says in general terms that in his opinion it is necessary to use violence to achieve his political objectives. He is convicted under a state law that makes violence or terrorism as a means of achieving political reform a crime. So you're the Supreme Court justices. If you think the KKK leader should be convicted, go to your left. If you're not sure, go to the middle. If you think it's free speech, go to your right.
Sorry, I don't think I what was the other case?
Here are the facts. A leader in the KKK gives a speech at a Klan rally that says in general terms, in his opinion, it's necessary to use violence to achieve political outcomes. He was convicted under a state law. Go to your left if he should be convicted. Go to your right if the Supreme Court should overturn the state that convicted him.
He just said he didn't actually use violence.
He didn't actually use violence. He advocated for the use of violence in general terms.
He did this at a public speech?
Yep. Okay. So you folks think that he's free to go? Not sure? You folks think that he's rightfully convicted. So, Brandenburg versus Ohio, 1969, the Supreme Court ruled the conviction is inconsistent with the First Amendment. Here's why. They ruled that freedom of speech does not permit a state to forbid advocacy of violence except where such advocacy is directed to inciting or promoting imminent lawless action and is likely to incite or produce such imminent lawless action. So it established the imminent lawless action and likely to produce that test. With that logic from the Supreme Court, does anyone on this side of the room change their mind and think the KKK leader should have been released? One person does. One person moves to the middle. Thinks it's reasonable but debatable. Fantastic. Okay. Second scenario is Nazis. So, the facts are a Nazi group planned to march through a Jewish community home to many Holocaust survivors. The state Supreme Court blocked them from marching. If you think the Nazis should be allowed to march, go to your left. If you're not sure, go to the middle. If you think that the Supreme Court should overrule the state, if you think that they should be blocked from marching, did I get my order wrong? If you think the Nazis should be allowed to march, go to your left. If you think the Supreme Court, if they can march, go to your left. If they can't march, go to your right. How's that? Your left. Okay, so most of the room gravitates toward the middle here, which is very interesting, and we've just got one on the left and one on the right. So in Texas versus Johnson, 1989, the Supreme Court, no, wrong one. In the National Socialist Party of America versus the Village of Skokie, 1977, the Supreme Court ordered the state to hold a hearing on their ruling, basically meaning they're free to march. So here's why. There is no hate speech exception to the First Amendment. And this is really important because anytime I turn on the news, the dialogue of today is that there should be censorship of hate speech. Point one, there is no hate speech exception. Point two, why? Because who gets to define what hate speech is? Whoever's in power at the time. And that is inconsistent with free speech. So what actually ended up happening here is the local court ruled that the Nazis were allowed to march, but they could not display the swastika. And then the state Supreme Court looked at the case and overruled it, saying they are allowed to march and they are allowed to display the swastika. And the logic behind this is, and I quote, "We accordingly, albeit reluctantly, conclude that the display of the swastika cannot be enjoined under the fighting words exception to free speech, nor can anticipation of a hostile audience justify the prior restraint." So because there was no imminent lawless action, or the likelihood of imminent lawless action, and because there were no fighting words leading to an imminent fight, they're free to march, albeit reluctantly. Does anyone change their mind after understanding that ruling? We have a strong movement in the direction of letting the Nazis march in favor of free speech. I say that tongue-in-cheek. We have a strong movement in the direction of free speech, consistent with the Supreme Court's ruling. So now we have the third scenario, burning the American flag. The facts are, at a political event, a protester burns the American flag. No one was injured or threatened. Witnesses who may have been military veterans who fought for the flag, who may have lost friends and loved ones in defense of the flag, are seriously offended. The protester is convicted under a state law of desecration of a respected object. If you think the man who burnt the flag should be convicted, go to your left. If you're not sure, go to the middle. If you think it's free speech, go to the right. The comment was, "I'm sure the Jews are very offended," and I think your comment hit the nail on the head. I think that is the core of the issue. Everyone went to "this is free speech." So in Texas versus Johnson, 1989, the Supreme Court ruled the conviction is inconsistent with the First Amendment. Why? It's expressive conduct because it's political in nature. It is not imminent lawless action. And in a free country, people are free to be offended. So the fourth and final scenario is the Trump administration cancelling the student visas of protesters engaging in hate speech. So the facts are that the US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, said that the United States has revoked at least 300 foreign students' visas as part of President Donald Trump's effort to clamp down on pro-Palestinian protesters on university campuses. If you think the visas should be cancelled, go to your left. If you're not sure, go to the middle. If you think it is free speech and the Trump administration should not have cancelled these visas, go to the right.
Sorry, can you repeat that? Which way to...
If you think the visas should be cancelled, go to your left. Or if you think the Trump administration is within its rights to cancel the visas, go to your left. Non-violent protest. If visas can be cancelled, go to your left. If that was a bridge too far, go to your right. So we have most of the room on the right, a few folks in the middle, and one gentleman on the left. So, and you asked this question earlier. I think the spirit of the First Amendment is that the government cannot take an action based on political speech unless there is imminent lawless action and the likelihood of imminent lawless action. Now, in recent days, The Trump administration backtracked on this. They restored the cancelled student visas. They also changed their public messaging to talk about revoking visas of students with criminal records. So they also changed the way they spoke about this publicly. And then yesterday, the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio said in a cabinet meeting, the best way to combat misinformation is freedom of speech. So it looks like the administration very deliberately changed its mind on this and then spoke powerfully about how the solution to misinformation is free speech and transparency. Question?
First of all, there are several court cases that are still open, so they have not been restored. Second of all, going after people with criminal records is not the same as people who are doing crimes. If you have a criminal record, it means you have been convicted and you have done your time. You served your sentence. And so you should not be punished. It's in the second, which minute is it? The fourth? You should be punished twice. And so deporting people with criminal records is punishing them twice. And so I don't think it was a reversal at all. I think it was just a change in wording.
We will need to see what happens, but if I was to make a prediction, I would predict that any of these court cases that saw their way through, that are based on the principle of free speech, not based on a criminal record, will be allowed back into the country. That would be my guess.
Are all amendments equal?
I think so the question was, are all amendments equal? That's a great question. I would like to look into that, but the way I would answer that is I would say no, the First Amendment is first for a reason, but all amendments would have the force of law.
Wait, did you say that the people like punishing?
No, this is people who are already here.
Right, but they already had a time.
People who are university students who have been convicted and served their time.
Are they here legally?
Yes, they're university students.
You can do your own student visa and you can like,
Most of them are green cards or student visas.
And they did their time already?
Assumably so, unless it was a fine. In which case they didn't fine.
Would you like my opinion on this? And now I'm speculating. My opinion on this is that the Trump administration reversed it because they realized free speech should trump these political considerations. But as politicians, I'm sure they're messaging it in a strategic way by shifting the narrative from cancelling visas over free speech to cancelling them over crime. But I think there's often a difference between what is said and what is done. And my prediction as to what will be done is that those visas will be restored, and any court cases premised on the First Amendment will see the government not have the right to infringe free speech.
Is it a little late for a presidency in its second term to realize that free speech is important?
I'm just glad that free speech is important.
Me too.
Now, in conclusion, I think the number one message for today is freedom of speech means your freedom to think. It's your freedom to think freely, to pursue truth, and I think that truth is good. Free speech comes from God, is explained by natural rights theory. It does not come from government. The reason we formed our government is to defend our natural rights. And anyone looking to censor your speech is really looking to control how you think, which is why the test set by the Supreme Court should be a high bar and is a high bar and is primarily based on whether or not speech is intended to incite or promote imminent lawless action and is likely to do so. And America is, to my knowledge, the country that does the greatest job on the planet of protecting our God-given natural right to freedom of speech and the freedom to think. Thank you. And you had great questions. Cool. Any other questions?
When you mentioned that truth is fragile, but it also leads to God, that seems like a contradiction to me. That something so fragile can also inevitably lead to God.
what's the connection between fragility and leading you to God?
Well, so God is inevitable, and His truth is inevitable. No matter what, you die eventually. You learn whether or not God is real, and He is inevitable. And so His truth being both inevitable and fragile is odd to me.
That's a good question. I'm not sure that an answer immediately jumps out. Does anyone else have an answer to that?
Can you be more specific when you say truth is fragile? I know you're saying that truth leads to God.
I'm just quoting him. So
Yeah.
Let me say what I mean by truth is fragile. A part of what's important about freedom of speech is it's oftentimes new ideas, controversial ideas, ideas that rock the status quo. They're the ones where there's a strong incentive to stomp them out because they affect the existing order, or they're truths that are disruptive. And I think the value of the marketplace of ideas is it helps enable the voicing of those ideas, it helps enable the discovery of those ideas, therefore it helps those ideas grow, get stronger, and gain more followers. And so I don't think the truth is fragile. I think new ideas that can lead you to truth are fragile. And so I'm more talking about creating an environment that enables ideas that may lead to truth to emerge. But I think when they do emerge, I think the truth grows strong.
in terms of an environment that kind of cultivates that new idea, that diversity of ideas that leads to the truth, do you think that allowing hate speech, threats of violence, death threats, do you think that kind of free speech should be welcome in a place that's trying to increase its diversity of thought and marketplace of ideas?
So I actually think that what one would call hate speech, one would call a new idea that might disrupt the status quo.
Is I'm going to kill you a new idea that's going to disrupt the status quo?
Well, the phrase "I'm going to kill you" is very close to imminent lawless action, especially if that person is standing within striking distance. So that's where the imminent lawless action test comes into play.
Death threats are not illegal, however. Only if they're proven to be imminent.
So one of the things that actually came up in my research here is there's a category of laws that beyond the imminent lawless action definition that do infringe on free speech, such as there's obviously a prohibition on child pornography, right? And there should be. But so one thing that I want to do more research on is that entire category of laws, whether it's death threats or slander or libel, I'd like to understand in more detail. Like the imminent lawless action test, I think, is the appropriate bar for speech that like is common. But I'd really like to understand the relationship between other laws that infringe free speech as well. And I think when you speak about death threats, that would come into that category. But so there's a whole other category of restrictions that I plan to learn more about.
I do have one more question.
Okay.
I noticed that one of your main points was that speech gives way to thought. I've never heard anyone say that. This is like the first time I've ever heard anyone say that. Usually, thinking comes before you speak, right? So, even if you aren't...
That's a really good point. We learn to think before we speak, and we learn to speak before we write. So it's almost like that's just stepping up to a higher level of thought, but it's all thought.
Usually you think about things before you say them, right?
Yes. But by saying them, you test how others are going to react, and that can inform your thoughts. So speaking is a type of thinking.
It is, absolutely. And it's one that I engage in a lot. It's kind of why I'm here. But I also think it's very important to be able to have critical thought without the input of others. I think that's a very important thing to have. And that way it can't be taken away from you.
I agree it's important. It's important as to where you draw the line.
We need to have an environment that encourages free speech, but we also need to have an environment that prohibits the government from infringing free speech. And I think that's what the Supreme Court has tried to do with imminent lawless action.
The most interesting thing from today, I believe, was whenever Matt asked the question of if we were okay with the Nazi social group parading through the streets of a Jewish town. And honestly, I was in the middle on that because I was uncomfortable with it. I put myself in the Jewish people's shoes and I was reconciling with them. Like, hey, I myself would not want someone who opposes everything I think in almost every way to be promoting their things, promoting what they believe in their area, like, and and I feel like I'd be attacked a little bit, but the Nazis said it was determined by the government that they were peacefully protesting and they weren't infringing upon any of the other Jewish people's rights. And it kind of made me realize that no matter how much I don't like something, freedom of speech is still what's most important.
For some reason that it is actually legal for certain things to happen, like the Nazis parading down the street, that is like allowed because it will cause like a mass feeling of being threatened among those individuals. I found that interesting that was legal for some reason, because I feel like there are some exceptions under the free speech thing, and making people feel threatened in their own homes, kind of one of them. So, but guess not.
When we talk about free speech, I've thought that Candace Owens has flipped the script. She's come out against Trump, and she's come out against deporting the anti-Semitic people, the Palestinians that are anti-Semitic, and she thinks that all of a sudden Trump is not for free speech anymore. And I would disagree with that. I believe that Trump is not against free speech. He is against the violence and the things that are going on with Jewish students being assaulted and molested, and Jewish businesses being interrupted. And it's more about the violence that is occurring and not the speech.
This episode of The Matt Sweeny Show is open sourced under the MIT license. You are free to download, use, copy, modify, merge, publish, distribute, sublicense, sell. Yes, you can use it commercially, so long as you include this notice and link to mattsweeneyshow.com. Thank you to my beautiful wife, Tusculum University, listener kids, and our contributors for making this episode possible. Support freedom and more episodes like this by contributing at mattsweeneyshow.com.